Today, I want to talk about Internet Explorer 10, in specific about the mobile version. There are a number of improvements that come in this version of Internet Explorer 10. I won't have time to talk about everything. App cache, blobs, history API are all things that we expect from modern web browsers. Today, I'm going to focus on some things that are specific to IE10, where they are standards compliant, but very advanced, and some other things that we expect from every web browser, especially from mobile. I want to start from forms. HTML5 brings a number of improvements to forms. They are backwards compatible. When they designed HTML5 for forms, they introduced a number of attributes and new tags that help create forms that are easier to fill for the user and easier to validate for the developer. The improved usability comes, for example, when you can enter a number or an email address automatically, and when you have a virtual keyboard, like on Windows Phone or on iPhone and Android, you get the correct keypad to enter the correct values. This means that filling the form is going to be less tedious for your users, and it's going to be easier for you to validate because you're going to have pseudo classes. I'm going to show you something in CSS that makes it easier for the user to see that the value is correct and basically stops the submission of the data before it's even delivered to the server side. Some of the things that have been added, some of them have been picked up from WAP specification, like the ability to enter a phone number, to force the user to enter a phone number or an email address. Other things are modern. They've been added now, like progress, the ability to define a range, and to move up and down values. HTML5 forms are actually pretty well supported across the major browsers like Chrome, Firefox, and Internet Explorer 10. This is a table that I created where actually the support is pretty spotty. We can see it's a yes and no all over the place. One thing that I want to highlight is that the way that HTML5 forms have been designed basically give no excuse to the developer not to implement these things. All the new tags and attributes actually have a very good fallback. So if you require, for example, a field to use a number or an email, if the browser doesn't support the attribute, it just falls back to the default input mode. So even though these things are not very well supported, for example, you should use them. You can use them with very limited downside for the user and pretty much zero downside for you. I have a little asterisk on the step up and step down for Internet Explorer. The step up and step down are two events for JavaScript that allow you, when you have an input field, let's say that you have a number field and you want to have any number from 1 to 10, step up and step down allow you to create, for example, a button, and then with JavaScript increment or decrement automatically the value. In Internet Explorer 10, it works, but it only works when you're using a type range. Type range is a new type introduced with HTML5. If you're using a type number or a type date, basically the step up and down won't do anything. This, to me, is a partial implementation because the specification doesn't say anything about it, but this is how Microsoft implemented it so far. I have a couple of screenshots that I took on my Nokia device. And I want to show you how HTML5 works. For example, so we have a new field, a new attribute called placeholder. Allows me, for example, in the first field to write John Doe as the suggested first and last name for the user. Or I have an example email address in the second field. These are placeholders. You know, they remove the need for you to use JavaScript to enter the value, remove it when the user selects it. It's basically instantaneous, and it requires just a couple bytes of code. And it has no downside if the browser doesn't support it. You can see that some of the fields are surrounded by a red color or a green color. These are the pseudo classes that I was talking about earlier. These are classes that you can use in CSS. You can use, for example, column required, column valid, And based on the input that has been entered so far by the user, if the user has filled the field or not, the color will change based on the rules that I specified in CSS. So the first 3 fields in my case are required. Until the user has entered the values, they will be red. For the following ones, I mark them as optional, so they are green because there's no minimum requirement. The second screenshot shows you how I required a phone number. There's the placeholder in the first screenshot. In the second one, you can see that once the user has selected it, the numeric keypad comes up. So the user is automatically forced to enter a number, and most of all, it's a lot easier because he can just type away. These are some of the things that you can do with HTML5. As I mentioned earlier, you can also specify a pattern. So for the number, for example, you could say it needs to be a US phone number with a plus at the beginning. It needs to be 11 digits. If you know the country where the phone number is required and you know the format, you could specify the format, and the browser will do the validation. The patterns are simple regular expressions, so you could say digits or letters, whatever you need. These are some of the improvements that come with HTML5, and as mentioned, really you should use them because there's no downside. Everything falls back to the default implementation of the input field, so they work really well, and they are supported across most browsers. The second thing that I want to talk about today is web performance. W3C has a working group called Web Performance. They are writing a number of specifications. The navigation timing is the most advanced in status. It's nearly a recommendation, I think. And performance timeline and resource timing are both currently in draft, so they're still being worked on. These are all implemented in Internet Explorer. There's also page visibility, which is another API that allows you to be aware if the page is visible to the user, something very useful. You might not want to fire a JavaScript event if the page is in background and there's no need to update data. There are a couple of other events, like request animation frame and set immediate. These are very useful for you to know to define callbacks for the browser to notify your code when the browser is ready to paint a new page or is done painting a page, so that you can fire your own event. This is much better than the set timer because it allows the browser to notify the developer when is the right time to run your code, and that saves battery, saves network, and saves CPU cycles, so it makes your page faster. We all want to be fast, and we all want to have our pages load fast, load quickly, and we need to know how quickly the page loaded. The navigation timing API is the first one that I'm going to talk about, and this is implemented in Firefox, Chrome, and Internet Explorer. So you have very good support across the browser. It's not implemented in Safari. It's not implemented in iOS 6. This API gives you access to information about how long the page took to load. It gives you a lot more information than simply the onload event, because you have access to everything, basically from when the navigation started. It's a little bit cut up there. Navigation start is the very first time when the user basically clicked on the link. You can see the information about redirection, DNS resolution, TCP, when the request was made, how long the server took to respond to your request. So it gives you a lot of detail about how long it took to load the page, as opposed to the onload event that basically is only the last bit. So this is a lot better for you to know how long it took to load your page and all the resources. This timing includes everything that composes the page, so JavaScript, CSS files, or images that were required for loading the page. Something that you should note is that if you try to access this information when the onload event is fired, you will basically happen to be around, well, sometime between the load event start and load event end, depending how many operations you have in between. So you might not have all the information that is available at a later stage. This is how you use the API. The first line, of course, I'm detecting if the browser supports the window.performance. Performance is the new object that is part of the specification, and everything that is part of navigation timing is under the performance object. In my case, I'm using timing. Of course, I'm picking up timing, which is the object within performance that gives me the timing information. And then I'm simply calculating how long it took to load the page. This is the simplest use case. You could go into more detail to try to understand, which event took a long time. During my experiments, I was looking at, for example, redirection, how long redirects took. There's a lot of talk, if your link was followed from Twitter, t.co, bit.ly, some other service in between, you will get all this information using this API. You will know exactly how long the browser spent to follow all the redirects, maybe multiple. Resource timing and performance timeline are the two new specifications. These are only implemented right now in Internet Explorer 10, but they are coming to Chrome and Firefox very soon. There was a workshop recently in the Bay Area, and basically all the browser vendors committed to implementing these new APIs. Similar to the navigation timing, the resource timing gives you a breakdown of all the events that happened for the browser to load the content. But in this case, it's for every single resource that composes the page. So the performance timeline tells you exactly which files were loaded when, in which order, and then resource timing gives you access to the loading of each of these elements. Again, you have access to redirect, app cache, because some of the files might have been in the local cache, DNS, TCP, and the request and response. This way, you have a much better view of all the details for the network, for the browser to request the files either on the network or locally. Similarly to the other API, it's under performance. It's, in this case, I'm using the method getEntries. There are other methods that are part of performance timeline. GetEntries is one, getEntries by type is another. Each entry in the performance timeline has a different type. It could be an image, it could be a CSS file, it could be a third-party file that is loaded by JavaScript. You have access to this type of information. In this case, I'm simply running a loop, loading each of the entries and reading the information. Again, just simply how long it took to load the file. You could filter down by images or CSS scripts. Something that you should note is that for privacy reasons, the working group decided that some of the information about the files that the browser loaded might not be available to you. For example, you might not have access to the URL of the file. For most files like an image or a CSS, you will have the field name that you can see here in this example. That one will give you the URL to the image or to the CSS script. Let's say that you have a Facebook button or you have some service that is loading, for example, images that might be private to the user. You will not have access to that information. You will know that a file was loaded, how long it took, but you will not know what file that was. So you need to pay attention to that when you're trying to build some statistics or analytics, for example, on how long it took to load your page. These APIs are very useful for example, what is called real user measurement. So knowing exactly how long it took for each user to load your pages and your content. You can build, of course, aggregated data. There are a couple of open source libraries. One is called Boomerang, one is called Sessions. You can download those, you can use them. There are 2 or 3 companies already using this type of APIs for measuring. And you can, if you use Google Analytics, there's a section called Page Speed that is usually showing the data from the navigation timing API. So these APIs are already out in the wild. They are available on Windows 8, on Windows Phone 8 for the performance timing and navigation and resource timing. Navigation timing is available pretty much everywhere. I'm going to move on to another topic. I'm sorry, I'm running a little bit fast. We only have 30 minutes in total, and I wanted to cover a lot. I will have a lot of links at the end of the presentation, and of course, if you have any questions, they're welcome. The next topic for me is IndexedDB. IndexedDB is implemented in many browsers, Chrome, Firefox, and IE10. In Chrome and Firefox, only the latest versions, respectively 24 and 16, have the support for the unprefixed version. Previous versions and IE10 all supported only prefixed. You might have heard about WebSQL. WebSQL was a previous standard that the W3C was working on. The group decided that it was too focused on SQL. You were basically building SQL queries in your web pages, and the group didn't like that approach. They wanted something more modern, so they decided to go to a NoSQL approach with IndexedDB, and they redesigned the whole specification. The specification comes with two APIs, synchronous and asynchronous. I would just say focus on the asynchronous one. That one works both independently or within a web worker. The synchronous API was only designed for web workers, but right now, not only no browser has implemented it, but there's basically no commitment to implementing. So I would just stick to the standard implementation of the asynchronous one. I have a couple of examples here. So as I mentioned, it is prefixed or unprefixed. Right now in the wild, there's a bit of everything. So it is important that you check basically every possible permutation of the possible prefix names. It's not supported in Opera or in Safari, so we don't need the Opera prefix, and Safari unfortunately won't work, so no Mac and no iOS devices. In this example, you see that I look at IndexedDB and IDB transaction. So every IndexedDB requires a transaction, so you cannot make operations on the database if you don't have a transaction open. So you first need to open the database, you look at the data, you can update it, but you always have to have a transaction open, and you can manage the transactions. Here's an example of opening a transaction. Something that I wanted to highlight is that in this example, you see that I'm opening the database. I have a database name, PeopleDB, and I have (1). This is the latest draft of the specification. So they changed how it works, and so I think it's important for you to see this. It's implemented this way in IE10, in the latest versions of Chrome and Firefox, but you might need to support the older version of opening a database, which was more complicated. You had to, in the older version, you had to open the database with no version number. 1 is the version number in this case. And then you had to either check the version, set the version, and maybe update it. The new specification is actually simpler. So when I open the database, I get a number of events. On success and on error are 2 of them. And then on upgrade needed is a new event that was defined with this new specification. Of course, if I have on success and on error, basically I just go ahead and I can start using the database, or I have to manage the error in case, for example, the database is not supported or I cannot move forward. But with the new event on upgrade needed, I have basically the opportunity, I get notified immediately that the schema that I have locally on the client and the schema that I have tried to open are not in sync. So I need to either update the schema or define a new one. In this case, I'm creating an object store. Everything in IndexedDB are object stores. And then I create the structure with name and email. And then I have a for loop that adds the people data that I had prepared previously. So I will use, again, the object store .add, and I can add the entries for my database. Again, it's a NoSQL database, so I'm entering each value, and then I can query them based, for example, filtering by name, by email. I will not be able to do joins, for example, as you would do on a SQL database. So the use of the database is a little bit different. I mean, if you've never used a NoSQL database, I suggest that you read something on how to get started. The last topic that I want to cover is pointer events. So touch events defined by Apple are the first thing that we had in web browsers to interact with the browser with our finger. And The problem with touch events is that they are specified by Apple, they are unique to Apple, and they are limited to touch. The reality of modern devices is that actually we have touch, we have mouse, we have pen, we could have other forms of input. And the current structure of these events don't work very well. Every web page has to take into account if it's a mouse event, if it's a touch event. The hover is not supported across all forms of input. The pointer events tries to actually bring cohesion and consolidation to these events. They are designed to be easy to migrate from mouse events to pointer events. So for example, the naming of the events is pretty much the same. Pointer down, pointer up, pointer move correspond exactly to the mouse events. So it makes it easy for the implementation. They are backwards compatible because each browser, the specification says how the pointer events have to fall back onto mouse events. So if the page defines the mouse event, the pointer event knows how to treat it. And there's a clear algorithm for browser vendors to implement. It is supported currently only in IE10 with a prefix, so the MS prefix. Google and Mozilla are both looking at the specification, so we can expect both probably an update to the draft, to the current draft, and most of all implementation across many browsers. Unlike what you would expect, Microsoft has already produced a patch for WebKit, and there is a Chrome build that you can test on a computer. I have the links at the end of the presentation. So as I mentioned, they are very similar to the mouse events, but what do they add? How do they make the page development more useful to me? Well, first of all, they are designed to be multi-touch, so they address new needs. When I look at the events offered by pointer events, I have, for example, information about the pointer ID. So each pointer is identified with a unique ID. So at any time during the interaction, the panning or zooming or other interactions that I might define, I will know exactly which of the touch points is doing which movement. They are designed by definition to try not to interfere with the platform. So for example, operations on the viewport like panning and zooming are by definition not allowed for pointer events so that you avoid interjecting with OS operations. And as I mentioned, the naming is very, very similar, so it makes it easy to transition. There are also some additions. You were able, for example, you had an ID for the mouse events to recognize left and right buttons. With multi-touch, of course, we need to address for multiple touch points. So this is addressed to, you have unique values to identify which touch point and which, how many. So was it the first, the second, the third? You might also, if the device supports it, you might also have information about the pressure that the finger or the pen is making on the device. This is a float number that goes from 0 to 1. By default, it's always 0. Otherwise, it's any number up to 1. I have a very short example. As I mentioned, there is not a lot to say about pointer events. They are very similar to mouse events. So again, I'm verifying if it's supported, and then I'm using pointer move, a listener on pointer move to see if I'm moving the finger or the mouse. And then max touch points is a new property that is added by the specification that tells me if the device supports multi-touch or not. In this case, it's simply if it's greater than 1, yes, it supports it. Of course, you need to take into account for devices that, well, browser implementations, they yet don't support this, so you need to have a fallback. And in this case, I'm using the MS prefix because that's what is today implemented in IE10. IE10 comes in different devices: Windows PCs running Windows 8, tablets like the Surface, Windows Phone. Although the engine is always the same, there are some slight differences that you need to take into account. So drag and drop and file API, for example, are not implemented in Windows Phone for various reasons. Drag and drop is not supported because simply you cannot drag and drop an item within Windows Phone. File API is not supported because there's not a proper file system. They felt like privacy might be an issue of websites requesting that you upload something that you shouldn't. These things are coming anyway, in other browsers they are being implemented, so I'm sure they will come in IE10 too. Snap View is specific only to Windows 8, so of course it's not supported in any other browser, and it's probably not going to be supported in any other browser. And some of the HTML5 form features that I mentioned earlier, like the custom error. The custom error is very useful addition to forms. It allows you to specify a message to show to the user in case that the value entered was not valid. So if you define, for example, a pattern to validate the content and the entered value does not match, you can also show a message very easily. It's just an attribute. This is not supported currently in Windows Phone, but it is supported in Windows 8. As I mentioned, I have a bunch of links. These are some of the content that I wrote about before this presentation. And then I have a bundle on Bitly with a collection of these links plus a lot more that just couldn't fit in one page. Assuming that you're not using sensors, for example, that are not present in Windows 8, you should be fine. Of course, you need to take into account the different viewports. So you will have to write different media queries to address the different browser sizes, but you probably want to do it anyway because of the snap view in Windows 8, for example. So in general, I would say the answer is if you're going from Windows Phone 8 to Windows 8, very easy. If you develop in Windows 8 and you want to use Win.js, that will not work in Windows Phone 8. Go ahead.
Are there any bits about WebGL and IE10 Mobile?
No WebGL. It's based on OpenGL. So Microsoft has no support right now for OpenGL, I don't think, in any platform. Excuse me? Databases? Yeah. So question is how to handle the collision of versions with the databases. It's left on you. So you have the on-upgrade needed event. So you have that's the moment when you have a chance to basically redefine the schema. So there's no way for you to update the schema. So when you notice a collision, you will actually have to basically wipe the database and recreate it. And if there's any synchronization issue, you should probably manage it on the server and then deliver the content to the client. No, there's no default tools to manage collisions. It's all left to you. So the IndexedDB API is pretty raw. So you have access to the database, you store the data, you read the data, everything else is in your hands. Something that I probably didn't mention is IndexedDB is for large storage. Something that IE10 supports and some of the other browsers also support is binary files, so blobs. Local storage, you should use local storage for smaller amounts of data or session storage for smaller amounts of data. So I'm not sure about Windows Phone, but IndexedDB on Windows 8 is supposed to have a limit, I think, of 250 megabytes. So we're talking about pretty large data. I saw demo apps where people were downloading images and using them offline. One of the great advantages of IndexedDB, of course, is that you can use it offline once the data is stored locally. All right, well, thank you, and I'll be around. You can find me on Twitter as well.